He's been one of the best-known politicians of his generation in Britain, but Boris Johnson is no longer a member of Parliament. He quit ahead of a parliamentary report into his conduct, a report that recommended he be suspended from the House for 90 days for deliberately misleading over lockdown parties. But is this the end of his political career? Welcome to the programme. I'm Philip Hampshire. This time last year, Boris Johnson was leading support for Ukraine on the global stage, but at home, he was dogged by accusations over his conduct, particularly during the lockdown. Here's a look at how he left.
Boris Johnson did not go quietly when he left the House of Commons. In an angry statement, Johnson blamed Parliament's Privileges Select Committee, who were investigating him over so-called Partygate. This is the political scandal surrounding gatherings held at Downing Street and attended by MPs and staff during the COVID-19 lockdown, when they should have been social distancing. Johnson was found to be deliberately misleading Parliament over lockdown breaches. Boris denied he knowingly broke restrictions and accused the committee of being a kangaroo court, determined to end his political career.
Is this the end, Mr. Johnson?
In Johnson's statement, he criticises the current UK government. The Conservative Party has the time to recover its mojo and its ambition and to win the next election, he said. His departure triggers a third by-election for the governing Conservative Party, creating political instability for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak.
Hasta la vista, baby.
As he left, Johnson said, "It's sad to be leaving, for now," reminiscent of his last words as Prime Minister. So is this really the end of Boris Johnson's political career?
In the studio, I'm joined today by Roger Evans, who's a British politician who served as Deputy Mayor of London under Boris Johnson from 2015 to 2016. Claire Pearsall, who is a former Special Advisor at the Home Office. And in London, we have Freddie Gray, who's joining us via Skype. He's Deputy Editor of the Spectator magazine, once edited, of course, by Boris Johnson. Right, if I start off with you, Freddie, what are your thoughts on Boris Johnson having to step down?
Well, my immediate thought is that I hope that this will be the last we hear of Partygate. But I know that that's a vain hope. Partygate, of course, is the scandal that has engulfed British politics for an unbelievably long time now. And I think that it all related to Boris Johnson, and that even though Boris Johnson did wrong, he lied, or he seems to have misled Parliament about parties that he attended, which were in breach of the lockdown rules in COVID that he broke himself. I think that hopefully now we can start to move on. And I don't think this is the end of Boris Johnson, but I do think he's out of the political picture for now, so that Britain can stop talking about this ultimately very silly story, which is what various politicians did during the COVID lockdown. And perhaps we can have a national conversation that is focused on something else.
Let me take this across to Claire. Claire, what are your thoughts on the fact that Boris Johnson has resigned from Parliament?
Well, I think he resigned before he was pushed. Now, Boris Johnson had a copy of the report given to him on Friday of last week. He saw that, he looked at the sanctions and decided to run. He didn't let the people of Uxbridge and South Ruislip have their say. He's just decided that he would go, and he's making more problems, I think, for Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, alongside Nadine Dorries, his sidekick, and now Nigel Adams, who is another MP who has resigned his seat immediately.
Roger, are you in agreement with that?
I'm in agreement with quite a lot of it. I think this is a defining moment in British politics, actually, because if you look back to that election in 2019, which doesn't seem very long ago, and you look at the people who were leading the major parties there, they've all gone. Jeremy Corbyn, whoever it was who was leading the Liberal Democrats, I can't remember briefly. They've all gone. And politics is just an incredibly different place from then. We've been through a period of ideological politics, and we seem to be going back to the sort of managerial politics that we saw under John Major and Tony Blair. Which means that we'll probably have a period of calm now. And I think for most people, they'll see that as no bad thing.
Now, he resigned from Parliament, but of course, as many people know, he stepped down from being Prime Minister quite some time previously to that. So why was he hanging around in Parliament, do you think? Was he hoping for a comeback tour?
Well, if you want to have a comeback tour, it's a lot easier to do it with a power base. And this decision has effectively deprived him of that. So it will be a lot more difficult for him to come back.
Was that its purpose, do you think?
It could well have been its purpose. I think one of the interesting things about Boris, and I knew him at City Hall, so I've known Boris for a long time, and he has a lot of good points. He has a lot of flaws, which people have criticised around telling the truth, for example. But they're flaws that he's had for as long as we've known him. Yet they only became important, I think, after Brexit, when people started pointing them out. And now we've already got, you might have seen in The Guardian today, a guy called Martin Kettle, I think, saying, now Boris is gone, we can rejoin the EU. And I think that sort of talk, unfortunately, fans the flames of conspiracy theories that was what it was all about. So, I think Martin and other pro-European people will do well to leave it alone for a bit before they start making that type of argument.
Claire, why do you think he hung around in Parliament? Do you think he was hoping that maybe he could come back to being Prime Minister again? Tony Blair, once he left office, he left. If you like, you rise above being on the backbenches. You have too much gravitas for that position.
I think Boris Johnson is just looking out for Boris Johnson, and he believes that he has a fan base who would put him back into power whenever he chose. Now, that isn't quite the way that you should run politics, and it's a really bad example to send the rest of them in the House of Parliament. But I think the debate has become so polarised, it is so divisive, and he felt he could be that person at the front, waving the flag, bringing everybody together. But as we've seen, the person that has caused Boris Johnson's downfall is Boris Johnson.
Let me bring this across to you, Freddie, because you work at The Spectator. Of course, you know Boris Johnson, or have known Boris Johnson reasonably well. What do you make of the fact that he chose now to step down from being an MP, having left being Prime Minister quite some time ago?
Well, I would say I think that the right final decision for Boris Johnson would have been for him to be voted out by the electorate. I think I probably would have voted against him. I disagreed with a lot of things he did in government. But the problem is that a lot of people who are inclined to like Boris Johnson, and he is a popular figure, whatever people want to say against him, he is a popular figure, is that even though he is obviously calling it as a conspiracy, there has sort of been a conspiracy against him. He's called it a kangaroo court, the parliamentary inquiry into his behaviour, and it is a kangaroo court. It's led by Harriet Harman, who hates him, who clearly wanted him out. It's sat on by a bunch of people who clearly hate him and want him out. And they may be right, and he may be wrong. But the fact is, the procedure to get him out was orchestrated by people who want to get him out. And anybody who doesn't admit that is lying to themselves.
I'm going to bring it across to Claire first there, because I heard a no.
But Boris Johnson had the perfect opportunity to stop the Privileges Committee looking into him, as did every single other MP in the House of Commons in June of last year, and they didn't vote against it. They also had ample opportunity to vote against Harriet Harman becoming chairman of the Privileges Committee, and they chose not to do that. Now, the Privileges Committee has a Conservative majority. And it was always going to be the case that any report would go to the House of Commons, which has a Conservative majority. So I think all of these cases around it being a kangaroo court is just absolute nonsense. And unfortunately, that phrase has now caught on. If it were a kangaroo court, would he have been allowed a very, very expensive barrister to represent him? Well, of course he wouldn't. So these kind of tropes that are put out there is pretty much the basic playbook of Boris Johnson. And if you look across the pond towards America, it's also very, very similar to what's happening with Donald Trump.
OK, I'm going to bring in a quote from Boris Johnson here. He actually said the following about his current situation. I am now being forced out of Parliament by a tiny handful of people. They are using these proceedings to drive me out of Parliament. Now, as you were hearing from Claire, Claire doesn't necessarily agree with that. I'm going to put it slightly differently. Isn't everyone always brought down by a tiny group of people? if they're a Prime Minister. Margaret Thatcher certainly was.
Every politician has a shelf life. And I think the gift is understanding where that shelf life is, having the self-awareness to walk away with some dignity. Now, if it really was a small group of people in just the committee, then surely Boris Johnson could have waited until the whole of Parliament had a vote on the committee report, because the whole of Parliament is not a small group of people. It's 650 plus members, but he wouldn't even do that. And actually, I'm quite pleased to see democratic institutions asserting themselves in this way, because it's a good precedent that's been set, and possibly they may regret setting it, because, of course, future ministers and future governments, and we may well have a Labour government, will be held to these sort of standards, and that's actually no bad thing.
Right, I've got a quote here from Tony Travers, who's the current director of the London School of Economics. Here's what he had to say.
I think it's unlikely that this will be the end of Boris Johnson's career. He's had the most remarkable career as it is. I think very few people would have imagined he could become Mayor of London, very few that he could then become Prime Minister, and he did both of these things. And of course, what he's done here is to stand down from a constituency he might well have lost at the next general election, and it gives him the freedom now to look for a safer seat.
Freddie, do you agree with that? Do you think Boris Johnson's time in politics is done? Or do you think he moves into this slightly strange statesman-like position like Jimmy Carter or like Tony Blair?
I think as your contributor suggests there, I think he could well make a political comeback. I think it seems unlikely now, but things change very, very quickly in politics. And I think it's quite possible, particularly if the Conservative Party get thrashed at the next general election, which it looks as though they probably will. He will emerge as a sort of king across the water, a rescue figure for the Conservative Party. And again, I don't say this, just before Claire corrects me, I don't say this with any kind of glee. I just think that that is a very realistic possibility.
OK, Claire. I think it's time to come to you.
No, I do think Freddie's right. I don't think this is the end of Boris Johnson in a political career, but I do think it is the end of Boris Johnson within the Conservative Party, because it does look as though they are going to get absolutely thrashed at the next election, and those supporters of Boris Johnson are in the seats which are the most vulnerable. So these red wall seats in the north of the country and certain seats that are middle England will go. And those are his supporter base. So I don't see he has a way back into the Conservative Party. He has burnt so many bridges, but I don't think it's the end of him on the political stage. I think it's open to him.
How do you see that working out then? Are you talking about Baron Johnson, for instance, and going through the House of Lords, or which, of course, a lot of other countries don't have that option? Or are you looking at him going off and, I don't know, joining the United Nations as head of UNESCO or something?
No, I don't even see that. I think that smaller parties, people in the United Kingdom are pretty fed up of the two main parties having all of the votes. So I think it is now right for smaller parties to come through, for a different coalition forming of government. I think people are ready for that.
Let me bring it across to you.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the commentators are forgetting some basic truths here. If you want to stand for the Conservative Party as a candidate, you actually need to be approved by headquarters to do it. Many people in the party, myself included actually, have been unapproved because we refused to fight seats we couldn't win. Isn't that precisely what he has just done? So, well, I think there'd be a degree of double standards, desperation possibly to take him back. So I agree with Claire. The Conservative Party is unlikely to be a Boris Johnson vehicle. Again, possibly something involving Nigel Farage. You can see Farage reaching out and suggesting he might join them. But one of Boris's great achievements he's perpetrated is to convince the right wing of the Conservative Party that he's one of them. When he was at City Hall with me, he was a massive taxer, a massive spender. He was promoting an amnesty for illegal immigrants in London. He even introduced a sugar tax in the staff restaurant at City Hall. There is nothing of the right about Boris Johnson.
Freddie, I'm going to bring this across to you. What do you think Boris Johnson does now?
I suspect well, there's reports that he's going to be the next editor of the Spectator, so I suppose I should watch out what I say. I think he will go back to speaking. He's being paid enormous amounts of money. He's famously very bad with money, and he has a lot of children to pay for. So I think he'll go back to a lot of speaking gigs and so on. But I suspect he still harbours political ambitions because he feels hard done by. And I know a lot of people will feel that that's ridiculous that he feels hard done by. But if you see it from his perspective, I think it is possible to understand why he feels like that, because he won this mandate in 2019 from an almost impossible political position. And then COVID happened and his premiership was effectively wrecked. And any chance that he had of making a success of Brexit, which may have been very small, may have been battling against the odds, was wrecked partly by COVID. You may argue that it was because Brexit was never going to work. But I think any chance that Brexit had of working was wrecked by the pandemic. And I then think because of Partygate and all these stories related to the pandemic, he feels betrayed and bitter.
Right. Now, since two of you have obviously directly been involved with the Conservative Party, and Freddie works for The Spectator, which is usually regarded as a right-wing newspaper, I will bring across a quote here from the Labour deputy leader. This is Angela Rayner, and she had this to say.
Well, I think the Privileges Committee is pretty damning. You know, it's serious. Boris Johnson is not only a lawbreaker, but a liar. He's not fit for public office and he's disgraced himself and continues to act like a, pound shot Trump in the way in which he tries to discredit anybody who criticises his actions when actually a decent public servant would have done the honourable thing, would have had a little bit of humility and would have apologised to the British public for what they put them through.
Claire, should he have apologised to the British public for what he put them through?
I think he has apologised to the British public previously. I don't think that is the biggest thing that we need to have had from Boris Johnson. But it's interesting, Angela Rayner is doing what all opposition MPs will do, is have a go at the government and point out how bad they are. But I think she ought to be careful because there are people on her own side who behaved badly during the COVID lockdowns and in Parliament in general. So I think there are no clean hands in all of this. But an apology, no. I think that what he needs to do is go away quietly at the moment and give us all a little bit of time to heal and actually deal with the issues that the country is facing.
Well, let me take this across to Roger. Roger.
Yeah, I think if an apology is necessary for anyone, perhaps it's for the campaigners and the people who helped to put Boris into office, because quite a lot of us had high expectations of him. And
you were one of those people who was campaigning for him and helping to keep him in office.
I was one of those people who campaigned to help us win the election in 2019. I'm afraid I wasn't part of the leadership election. I was in Iraq during that time, which is a pretty good way of keeping your hands clean, I think. But my attitude to Boris was I'd seen his failings at City Hall, but I was his deputy there, and I worked to help make that a success. And generally with people, you believe they learn from their failings and they become better. And I had hoped that was what was going to happen when Boris became Prime Minister. Now, unfortunately, it didn't. And I think we saw some of the more troubling things that happened at City Hall, which we were able to deal with in that environment, happen in an environment where there wasn't a safety net. And I do feel let down, actually. I think a lot of people in the party will feel let down. And that's why I don't think the party will be a Boris Johnson vehicle again.
Freddie, let me bring this across to you. There does seem to be somewhat of a troubling trend in the West at the moment, and it doesn't matter whether we look at Donald Trump or whether we look at Silvio Berlusconi or whether we look at Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, Boris Johnson, another example of this, where either leaders immediately after they leave office seem to suddenly find a large number of official channels looking after them for some form of prosecution. And this, is there a concern in your mind about that?
Yes, it's funny you mentioned that. Yesterday, I interviewed an Argentinian film director about a film about nuclear power. But he said to me, we were talking about what's happening with Boris, and he said to me, you're all becoming Latin America. And I think there's an element of truth to that, in that no longer democratic results are respected and held in the same esteem that they used to be. They now become subjects of legislation. And this is not a partisan point. As you point out, Nicola Sturgeon it's happening to. Donald Trump didn't accept the election result himself, but equally when he won, that result was not accepted by the Democratic Party. The word the elites is overused, but the fact is that high-grade political institutions in Western countries are not accepting the will of the people. And I think that is a very, very troubling trend.
I want to make it very clear, Nicola Sturgeon has not been charged. She is being spoken to by police in her particular case. Claire, is there a problem here with that, or is there something that actually we should go, well, yes, all the politicians need to be held to account, because, of course, if you've done something wrong while you were in office, you need to be held to account the same as anyone else's. But it does seem to be a growing trend of sort of legislation and the process and mechanics of the law, if you like, to go after former politicians.
I think politicians like to be popular. They want to be wanted by everybody and they want to be adored. And the problem with politics is you have to make some really hard decisions. You have to make some uncomfortable decisions and sometimes incredibly difficult to make your people poorer for a short while if you're looking at high inflation and high interest rates. But I think that this is a problem that's worldwide. And it was quite interesting what Freddie was just saying about Latin America, because it is very much like that. Everybody is polarised. Everybody is now taking one side or another. And the art of debate, unfortunately, seems to be lost.
Roger, hold on, we're running out of time here, so I'm going to put a slightly different question to you. Do you think this helps Labour, or do you think this is irrelevant to their election prospects?
I think it has to help Labour in the short term. But I think the standards which have been set now by the Privileges Committee, if they are carried through in future, will make it quite challenging for government ministers and people who are trying to set policy, because there will be more intrusion into the decisions that they make and more at stake if they mislead the House or even if they mislead the House without intending to, apparently. So we could see a lot more safety first amongst politicians, a lot less inclination to take risks.
Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing? Because that's a double-edged sword, isn't it?
It sure is, and possibly we've had enough of people taking risks for the medium term. But you look at Margaret Thatcher, you look at Tony Blair, people who've actually made changes. They didn't do it without taking risks, and they have to make themselves unpopular to be able to achieve things. If you're not prepared to do that as Prime Minister, you probably shouldn't apply for the job.
Claire, you think that's reasonable?
I do. I think that politics is a really, really tough business and nobody is going to come out of this unscathed. And if you look at what happens to former Prime Ministers, they age very, very quickly. The weight of the whole country is on their shoulders, and that isn't to be underestimated. It is a tough job.
Freddie, I'm going to bring this back across to you for the last answer. Do you think that this is going to help the Labour Party, or do you think this now sort of puts a stamp on it and then gets rid of the issue now?
I think this helps the Labour Party. For all of Boris Johnson's flaws, he is a tremendous electoral campaigner. And I think if you talk to anyone who works in machine politics in the Labour Party, they are extremely relieved that they do not have to fight Boris Johnson. Similar again to the Democrats with Trump. They like him to be the opponent in a way, but when it comes to an election campaign, they would rather fight someone else.
Freddie, what do you expect to see come out from the other smaller parties on this? Do you expect the other smaller parties to just go, well, thank goodness we didn't get caught out on anything like this? Or do you expect the other smaller parties to start looking for more scandals now? They've got a scalp. They've had some success.
Well, I think the interesting thing will be what happens to smaller parties on the right. There is the Reform Party, which is a sort of break-off from UKIP. UKIP still exists. There is now thought to be a political opportunity on the right, because there will be a lot of people who feel betrayed over Brexit. It's an interesting question whether the Tory party can still win those voters over, or whether, in a peculiar way, they go back to Labour. All these options are on the table. But I think what happens to a small party like the Reform Party is interesting. And I would expect the Lib Dems to grow too.
Freddie, Claire, Roger, thank you very much, all three of you, for joining me today. I'm afraid that that's all we have time for today's show, but you can find more discussion and debate if you head on over to our YouTube channel. Just go there and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me here and the entire team, thank you for watching, and goodbye.